Hey everyone, welcome to the June 11th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I am David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski as we look back on the Belmont Stakes Racing Festival. It was 4 days of high-class racing, really the first 3 though, graded stakes on each card, culminating with that Saturday Belmont Stakes Day card. I think there were 9 graded stakes races. I want to say 7 or 8 grade 1 affairs. It's hard to keep count at this point, but such great racing on Saturday. We're going to go through all of it. We'll talk about almost all of the stakes action from that Saturday card, kind of going in reverse chronological order, beginning with the Belmont Stakes. We'll, of course, discuss the Friday card in depth that featured the Grade 1 Acorn, as well as a couple of other Grade 1 Turf Stakes races. And then we'll mention some of the top racing from Thursday, because a couple of horses did earn some nice speed figures earlier in the week. And we'll try to touch upon all of the top racing that took place during this Belmont Stakes Racing Festival, because, Craig, there was a lot of it that came out as Fast and Furious last week.
It was, and I made a post on X that, you know, as you get older, it's kind of hard to be a little bit jaded and, you know, always kind of look for the old days were better. But this was a great day of racing from start to finish. And really, you could say that about the whole weekend, particularly Thursday through Saturday. Sunday was a little bit of a washout, but the rest of the week was just absolutely fabulous. I don't know what more a horse player could ask for.
Yeah, I think by every metric, the weekend was a huge success. I know there were some concerns early in the week about the weather. Thankfully, that mostly cooperated. I know there was some rain that fell, and unfortunately, Sunday's card was completely washed off the turf. But right up on through Saturday, it seemed like things really did take a turn for the better in terms of the weather, and all of the racing was able to be contested over what seemed like fair courses. I know there's some debate about maybe the dirt courses favoring speed a little bit. I'm sure we'll get into that discussion. But it did seem like, unlike some of the Derby and Preakness Day stakes races where we had a wet track, particularly on the Oaks Friday, and then the Preakness weekend with so much rain falling, it looked like that could be the case early in the week for this Belmont Stakes Racing Festival. But fortunately, mostly dry courses for all of the stakes action that we're going to talk about on this podcast. And I was there for the Saturday racing. It was just one of those great cards to actually be there in person. So much exciting racing. It was just a really great vibe at Saratoga. And that's one of the great things about the race being at Saratoga. You know, the facility at Belmont Park, obviously the old facility, it just had a different character to it. I mean, it was that huge building where, it took forever to get from one end to the other. At Saratoga, there's just a different energy about the place. And it felt kind of like you were there in the middle of summertime, even though the weather wasn't quite as warm as it would be. I think the only negative was some of the bathroom lines, which have been well documented on social media. But that didn't detract from the day too much. It was just an awesome day of racing. And Craig, that's where we'll start with the Belmont Stakes Saturday. And we'll begin by discussing that third jewel of the Triple Crown, which was contested at Saratoga this year at the different distance of 1.25 miles. And we talked last week about how the 1.25 miles distance changed this race a little bit, probably it prompted some connections to take a shot at the Belmont Stakes, whereas maybe they wouldn't have if the race were 1.5 miles. And Craig, I'll share my PPs on screen as we start to talk about this race, and we'll take a look at the TimeformUS chart. Dornoch got the job done in a significant upset, went off at 17-1 to win this race. We talked about it on the podcast last week, Craig, not to redboard this horse because neither one of us had this horse that high in our picks. I think I picked him 4th in this race, but he was the horse that had the worst trip of all in the Kentucky Derby. You just kind of wondered how much it really counted because he was a horse who had been a little disappointing so far in this 3-year-old season, but he certainly got back on track in a big way when it counted on Saturday.
He did. It was quite the effort. And he's a horse that you wonder if it was at Belmont at 1.5 miles, would he even have been in the race? But he was in the race and he just ran a huge race. I know there was a case to be made for him based on his bad trip in the Kentucky Derby, but I couldn't get there. I know you couldn't quite get there, though you came closer than I did. But it was quite the effort from him. It's not like anything was easy about his trip this day. The pace was solid to fast. He was battling with another horse and Seize the Gray, who was coming off a Preakness win. Put that one away, and just as he did, then he had to deal with Mindframe. Never really had to deal with Sierra Leone, who just kind of clunked up really for third. But Yeah, good effort by him. I didn't see it coming, but he ran a very nice 125 TimeformUS speed figure and just capped off what was, to me, what you really want from a Triple Crown as a horse player, in that we had 3 races, all won by different horses, and more importantly, all paying very nice prices.
Yeah, it was a great series of races for bettors who wanted to take some shots against the favorites, and that was certainly the case in this Belmont Stakes. As for the trip that Dornoch got, the pace was honest. I wouldn't say it was an extremely fast pace. I know we'll talk about a few of those later in this podcast, but it definitely was a pace that was a little taxing on a few of the front runners. I think Seize the Gray, who was up there, he couldn't keep pace in the second half of this race, whereas Dornoch was able to take over from him. And something we saw from this horse as a 2-year-old, Craig, in the Remsen, was that Dornoch is really game. And when he is able to be in the mix every step of the way, he's going to fight for it at the end. I don't think we got the chance to see him really show that grit in races like the Bluegrass, and especially not the Kentucky Derby, where he was never able to get into the forward position that his connections wanted him to attain. But he was right up there every step of the way in this race, and he just didn't want to let anybody pass. You will see this point at the top of the stretch where Mindframe ranges up on the outside, and we should talk about Mindframe a little bit, Craig, because he was his own worst enemy through the stretch of this race, overreacting to the strong left-handed whip from Irad Ortiz, drifting to the outside portion of the track, whereas Dornoch just kept that straight course, kept responding to that pressure from Luis Saez all the way to the wire, and he was able to gamely fend off his rivals. But I'm not going to argue with anybody who says that Mindframe might have run the best race on this day.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I guess I could get there, but it's not like he really lost a lot of momentum when he veered left. He was still beat by, I think it was a half length. It looked like maybe it was even a little more. So I don't want to take anything away from Dornoch. Had Mindframe more run completely straight through the stretch, maybe he gets there, maybe he doesn't. I think if you do the math, he probably didn't lose that much distance by veering out. It's just a matter if you think he lost momentum, and it's a close call. Either way, he ran great. I mean, it was his 3rd career start. He kind of backed up what we saw in those first 2 races. Didn't really know how he'd handle the better competition, but the answer's there. I mean, he handled it just fine. And this is one really exciting 3-year-old going forward. Hard to say who leads the division. Obviously, it can't be him because he hasn't won one of these races yet. But by the end of the summer and early fall, who knows? Maybe it will be, because he's shown talent as much as anybody else has in here.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell in the pan shot, Craig, because they were so far apart. But I was watching this race just before the 8th pole, kind of where they started the race. And I was actually watching the race with my dad, and he took a picture at that point. And Mindframe had almost a length on Dornoch at mid-stretch. It's kind of hard to tell in the pan shot, but he really did take the lead. And I think the drifting in the stretch really did cost him in the end. When you watch the head-on, he veered out a good 5 to 6 paths and then came in that same amount. And it's hard to do that in the stretch and not say that a half length might not have been the momentum lost when all is said and done. You add it up at the end of the day. As for Sierra Leone, I didn't really see the excuse. I know Chad Brown had some post-race quotes really dissecting the race, seeing where the margin could have been made up. I think Chad Brown is, understandably so, gotten very nitpicky about the trips this horse has gotten in both the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness. And I get it, Craig. I mean, as horse players, we understand it. When you lose by a narrow margin, you go back through the race, want to blame the jockey, blame the circumstance, what could have been done differently, what could I have done differently to change this result around, and you do overanalyze those things. At the end of the day, though, Craig, we talked about it on the podcast last week. Sierra Leone's greatest asset was his consistency, and he ran his race once again, but it's not like he had any kind of speed figure edge on these horses coming into the race, and he actually ran his highest TimeformUS speed figure yet. He was just 3rd best on the day.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I mean, he just got beat. And it's one of those cases where, as horse players, it's easy to forget it in big races. But if you're going to take deep closers at a short price, you're asking for trouble. And at the end of the day, Sierra Leone is a deep closer. He has no early speed. He always drops to the back, and he's at the mercy of trips and pace and traffic. And it's just a risky proposition if you want to take 8-5 on a horse like that. He runs well. He shows up every time, but he's always going to face that unless he somehow changes his running style going forward. The one thing I'd say, it didn't seem like he veered in as bad as he usually does. There was still a little bit of it, but I don't think it really cost him anything as far as finishing position.
Yeah, when I watched the head on, he came in maybe a couple of paths at the top of the stretch, came in a little further thereafter, but then actually Flavien Prat, when he shook the right rein at him or pulled on the right rein, he got him to veer out around the drifting mind frame to come outside of that horse in deep stretch. So it seemed like Sierra Leone was a little more maneuverable in this race, and he did keep that whip in his left hand, which I think is what Chad Brown really wanted to see Tyler Gaffalione do in the Derby. I think that was his major criticism of Tyler's ride in that race. But at the end of the day, Craig, this horse got some pace to close into, had his chance, and just couldn't quite get there. And what you say about deep closers, it was true of Honor Marie as well. Just got really far back in the early stages. And it's tough to make up that amount of ground, especially over a Saratoga dirt course that I think just naturally is not so favoring to deep closers unless the paces really fall apart. And that's not what happened in this Belmont Stakes. So I thought both of those horses ran well. Sierra Leone probably got the mile and a quarter a little better than Honor Marie did. They just weren't quite as good as the top two finishers. I don't have a whole lot to say about anybody else in this race, Craig. Unfortunately, I think that flurry of activity, the 3 races in 5 weeks, might have taken its toll on both Seize the Gray and Mystic Dan because they each just looked a little dull in this spot.
They did, and maybe Seize the Gray is a little bit that he really does favor a wet track and isn't quite as good on a fast track. But yeah, neither one of them really ran much at all, particularly Mystic Dan. He's a good horse. I'm sure he'll bounce back, but it seems like he probably needs a little bit of a rest.
Before we move on from this race, Craig, I guess what do we make of the 3-year-old picture right now? Because as you said, we had some upsets throughout the Triple Crown, 3 different horses winning these races, 3 very different results in the 3 races. We had some horses who unfortunately had to miss the Triple Crown races and might be laying in wait for some of these mid-season targets like the Haskell and the Travers. Just looking ahead to the Haskell, I know Muth is pointing there for Baffert. Supposedly Fierceness is coming back there. I guess we'll see. We'll see it when we'll believe it when we see it, I think is how the phrase goes. We're not going to talk about any racing outside of Saratoga from this past weekend, but Bob Baffert did have a very impressive winner at Santa Anita on Sunday with Parenting beating a field of maybe suspect quality, but doing it very well and now taking his record to 2 for 2. So there are some other 3-year-olds out there, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the second half of the season.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting. Luckily, we don't have to vote for anything right now. I guess if I had to say who was leading the division, it would probably be Mystic Dan, just based on his win in the Preakness, his win in the Derby, which is the biggest race. A good second in the Preakness, won one of the preps at Oaklawn, but luckily it doesn't matter because you could make a case for a lot of horses. And as you say, there's no saying that the horses from this Triple Crown series have to be 3-year-old champ, because there's a lot of others lying in wait with some real talent.
Yeah, even Nisos, who was so good early in the season. I saw our colleague Steve Anderson tried to ask Baffert about that over the weekend. No update or no answer from about that. So I don't know if that horse is ever coming back or coming back this season. But hopefully, fingers crossed, he does make it back because he looked like such a talent early in the season. Well, let's talk about some other Grade 1 action from this Saturday card, because there was plenty of it, and we'll kind of go in reverse chronological order as we talk about these stakes races. So the race right before the Belmont was the Grade 1 Manhattan. And Craig, familiar result here, Charlie Appleby Exacta as Measured Time beats his stablemate Nation's Pride, but he did so pretty decisively and what looked like a very competitive race heading in. This 2-length margin, it was a decisive win by Measured Time.
It was a strong race. I mean, he gets a 129 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. And I really liked the way he did it. I liked the ride on by Bill Buick. Just being aggressive with this horse from the outside post. It was a race where you knew Strong Quality was going to take the lead or try, but you didn't really know who else was going to be up there. And maybe Program Trading looked like the horse who was the most dangerous. And Buick just took it right to him early. He didn't play any games. I think he knew he had the best horse, and he just got that really good position early. Eventually, we're going to see on the replay here that the other horse does take the lead, Strong Quality. But by then, I mean, the race is pretty much over if you think you're on the best horse at Measured Time. I don't think he had any worries about Strong Quality, and he really didn't have to, and he had plenty left in the tank. Just a really strong effort by him, and I hope this is a horse who stays here in the States because he's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it didn't seem like anybody really wanted the early lead in this race. I think the jock on strong quality just kind of came out expecting that he would fall into the lead. But I mean, William Buick, he broke well with wet measured time, and he was kind of out by himself from the far outside post position in the middle of the track, and just sort of let this horse stride forward. He wasn't grabbing him or taking a big hold in the opening quarter, and sometimes jockeys will do that to ensure that they don't get the lead. But in allowing measured time to stride forward, it sort of forced strong quality to set a more legitimate pace than maybe he otherwise would have. And I think it created a truly run race. And at the end of the day, this horse was just much the best, Craig. He was outside, stalking, free running every step of the way, but still was able to produce that kick in the stretch. It was sort of a blanket finish across the track for second. I do think Nation's Pride was clearly the second best horse because he had to go around everybody and cover ground around both turns. Didn't really have much cover around the second turn. So I thought he ran the second best race here, Craig, but you can see it's sort of a blanket finish for that runner-up spot with 4 horses across the wire. And it looked like a really competitive field going in. I think we saw a lot of horses run well in this race. There were some disappointments. I think a good point to both Chad Brown runners, Program Trading, and I'm Very Busy, and say that they probably didn't run back to their better races from early in the season.
Yeah, it's 2 in a row for I'm Very Busy where he hasn't really shown up. So you have to wonder if there's something going on with him, or, maybe he was just a horse who was in peak form and just isn't quite there anymore. Program Trading, we mentioned, I mean, he kind of won on the trip, but he's been a really, really good horse, but just one of those we see over and over and over again. Our best turf horses at this point just really can't stand up to the European shippers.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen Charlie Appleby have plenty of success so far this year, even when starting multiple horses in a race as he did here. And he reportedly is going to be keeping a string of these horses in the U.S. for the rest of the season. I don't know if Measured Time is going to be one of those horses, if he's going to have future targets in the U.S. He obviously took well to American racing here, so it'll be exciting to see if he sticks around for some major Grade 1 races later in the summer, potentially running here again before the Breeders' Cup. Let's move on to another dirt race from this Saturday card filled with Grade 1 action, the Grade 1 Metropolitan Mile. This one going the 1 mile distance uniquely out of the Wilson Chute for the first time being run at Saratoga here. And Craig, Flavian Pratt on National Treasure, I thought just rode this horse like he knew he was on the best runner in the race. He came out really unconcerned about the other speed, hoist the goal, wanted to get to the front end, didn't really care about how fast he had to go, and just knew he'd have the horse to finish off the race. And he was right on this day.
He was. And yeah, hoist the gold's a pretty quick one. He's a horse that, I don't know, it seems like they're running him in a lot of impossible spots, but he got a good third here, and I think he's a horse in good form. And the way National Treasure was just able to shake him off and keep running, I was really impressed. And I thought it was the right ride by Pratt to do exactly what he did coming out of that Wilson Chute from an inside post. I don't think you want to take the risk of getting shuffled. And I really like to see those kind of aggressive tactics. And National Treasure was just much the best on the day. Once he put him away, it was never in doubt. He ran to 129 TimeformUS speed figure. So the third North American start in a row where he's had at least a 128 or better. He won the Pegasus at 1 1/8 miles. I think it's kind of hard to argue he's the leader of the older horse division right now.
Yeah, and at first I was a little disappointed with the final time of this race, Craig, because he didn't run that much faster than another horse that we're going to talk about later in this podcast that I think was competing in the first race of the day at Saratoga on Saturday, that just being an allowance race. But, I mean, he set a much faster pace than that horse did, and that's reflected in the TimeformUS speed figure, where I think he got a 4-point upgrade from his 125 final time number to a 129 TimeformUS speed figure, which is the kind of quality that you'd be accustomed to seeing in a race like the Met Mile. Maybe not the greatest Metropolitan handicap winner that we've ever seen. I think we've seen some really awesome performances in this race over the years, but it was a Grade 1 quality effort. There, to be fair though, Craig, there wasn't a whole lot of running going on behind him in this race. You can kind of see it in the stretch run. 4 horses across the track, nobody really stepping forward to play second fiddle to National Treasure on this day. Post time just barely getting his nose on the line for second. He just wasn't good enough at the end of the day. He ran his race. I think we just saw post time has a little bit of a ceiling. The big disappointment, obviously, was White Abario, who sat off the pace early, came under pressure around the far turn, and just really had no answer in the stretch. And now it's twice in a row that we've seen a pretty disappointing effort from last year's Breeders' Cup Classic winner.
Yeah, and I've read since by one of our colleagues at DRF, I forget which one I read it from, but he's been transferred back to the barn of Saffie Joseph. I think he's going back to Florida to, I guess, try to regroup and see if they can regain that form of last year. But it's been pretty ugly the last couple. He was never really a factor. As you said, not the strongest field. Post time ran his race. I have no complaints with the ride this time. He was just second best horse. The one that really intrigues me is Hoist the Gold. He was able to stick around for third. And like I said, he's just been in some really impossible spots, maybe running too long. But I think this horse is going to be interesting if he turns back to sprints, particularly like 7 furlong sprints where he can use that speed and has some stamina built up. I think he's better than his results show. And one thing, I guess I wanted to bring this up at some point. This feels like as good a time as any. He was able to hold on to third for that. I saw some people talking about that as, a product of a biased track. I tried to defend it, saying I didn't think it was an overly speed biased track. It's just kind of dirt racing, in particular Saratoga. What did you make of the track? I thought it was really pretty fair, to be honest. I mean, maybe it was slightly speed favoring, but when aren't dirt tracks in Saratoga in particular?
Yeah, you see, for this day in TimeformUS, our bias algorithm did not flag it as a speed bias based on the results. Even with Dornoch winning the Belmont Stakes, you might have thought that kind of result would tip to at least a pink color coding, but it's a white color coding, as you can see around that 127 race rating box, indicating that it was a neutral racetrack, at least as far as what was expected from the TimeformUS PPs. Craig, I think speed did well on Saturday, but when you watch Saratoga over the past several seasons, especially since they changed the dirt track at Saratoga, which I think happened 4 or 5 years ago, ever since then, it's just been a surface that seems to favor speed a little bit more. I think that's just the baseline for the Saratoga dirt track, that it's hard to be a deep closer over this surface. And for me on Saturday, it was kind of nothing different than the norm at Saratoga. I watched it more for like a path bias to see if the rail was the place to be, because when you watch this Met Mile, I mean, you see a big long shot like Castle Chaos sticking around to almost be in that photo for second and wondering if maybe the track carried him a little bit. But when I watched the other races, didn't feel like there were too many other horses that were carried along by the rail necessarily. I know Dornoch rode the rail and was basically glued to it every step of the way in the Belmont Stakes, but we're going to talk about some other races where it didn't seem like the rail was any kind of particular advantage. So at the end of the day, I think it was just a pretty normal Saratoga dirt track. And when the track plays as fast as it does, and I think this is more something to mention, Craig, when you see consistently fast times, I think a track that is just playing very fast on a big day like this, it tends to favor speed, because a fast surface tends to carry speed a little bit better than a slow surface does. And I think it also tricks some fans into thinking speed is holding, because when you see a half and sub 46 going this 1 mile distance, you think that's a crazy fast pace out of the Wilson chute going the mile. But then you look at the TimeformUS pace figures and they're 140, which is solid, but there's no red color coded pace figure line for this Met Mile. It's not being coded as an extremely fast pace in TimeformUS, because obviously, the what you've programmed in TimeformUS, Craig, it checks for how fast the track is playing, the norms for that distance. And I think people just tend to see really fast early splits when the track is playing fast, and then they're surprised that those horses hold on, not really taking into account that the final times are fast too. So it's not a big surprise that the entire race went fast. I think I in a roundabout way, I just kind of said that you need to take into account how fast the track is actually playing. So for me, it was a pretty fair track that was favoring speed a little bit, but that's kind of what you should have expected going into the day.
Yeah, and just a couple quick things before we move on. One, these are good horses. I mean, really good horses, the best of the best. And you're not going to see fractions like you see on a Friday allowance race. I mean, these
Mhm.
are the best horses. And two, you brought up a good point. When the track is really fast, it's essentially shortening the race. I mean, yeah, we measure races in distance, but stamina is about getting to that point and how fast to do it. If it only takes a minute and 34 seconds to run a mile as opposed to a minute and 36 seconds, suddenly you don't need quite as much stamina. And that's probably part of it as well. So I thought the track was fair, but people, to me, seem to forget these are the best of the best and they're going to run fast. And it's hard to just look at these fractions as they pop up on screen and judge how fast they really are.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into the next race we're going to talk about, Craig. Race 9, the Grade 1 Jaipur, going 5.5 furlongs on a turf course that was playing extremely fast. Even though we got some rain on Friday, it dried out basically within an instant to produce the kind of time that it did for this Jaipur. Now, don't get me wrong, Cogburn is a really good horse, Craig, but speaking about pace, you might look at the raw fractions for the Jaipur and say, well, whoa, 43 flat is a really fast pace, except relative to the final time, which is what the TimeformUS Pace figures are based on, and the color codings are based on. It's all relative to the final time. Well, 43 is exactly the kind of split that you would expect for an even pace when the winner finishes up 5.5 furlongs in sub 1 minute, 59-4. I didn't know it was possible to run 5.5 furlongs that fast, but apparently when you get a fast, hard turf course and a horse that's as naturally quick as Cogburn, things like this are possible.
Yeah, I know right after the race, you kind of sent out the bat signal for the timing of this one. And I timed it as soon as the replay came up, and it was perfectly fine, which I mean, the way the course had been playing, I wasn't all that surprised. I looked at my wife, Elsie, and said, I think that time's probably good. And it checked out. It was absolutely spot on. And it's just a function of the course and the way it was playing, despite that little bit of rain that they got. I'm kind of looking up as I talk what the run up was, because I think it's a pretty long run up as well. I did just check it. It's 100 feet, and that checks out with races run at this distance. So over a fast course, when the best sprinter in it, definitely the country, maybe even more than that, catches he broke really well. He's going to run a fast time, and that's what happened here. I'm not taking anything away from him, because I think personally this was probably the performance of the day. The TimeformUS speed figure certainly says it was a 131. Cogburn definitely answered some questions. There was some talk maybe he's a horse who needs some give in the track. Well, he certainly didn't need that on Saturday, because the course was rated a 9 on the TimeformUS scale, and he's just by far the leader of the division right now. He's fast, he's versatile, he can adapt to different pace scenarios, and it's hard to see somebody beating him in this country if he stays in this kind of form.
Yeah, once he got towards the front and actually took the early lead and was traveling as easily as he appeared to be, you knew he was going to be tough to beat. And when you win a turf sprint by 3.5 lengths at this level, it's showing real dominance. And the result of this race was logical, Craig. The horses that were expected to run well behind him, like Arzak and Star of Mystery, they did so. They just weren't in the same league as this horse. Cogburn has just completely turned his career around since they focused on turf sprinting with him. I think his only loss came on that quirky course at Kentucky Downs where he couldn't quite get 6 furlongs. But I mean, he looks like a true 5.5 furlong horse, and he's going to be tough to beat from here on out. The Breeders' Cup is at Del Mar this year. I believe they run this race, the Breeders' Cup turf sprint, at 5 furlongs at Del Mar. That should be right up Cogburn's alley. He just seems like he's going to be a real force to be reckoned with in this division moving forward. And I don't disagree. This might have been the performance of the day on Saturday. 131 TimeformUS speed figure, one of the highest that I can remember for a turf sprint. And, Craig, you're right. It shouldn't have been too surprising that a time like this would be possible at this level. You remember at Belmont Park, when that turf course would get baked in the summer, we would see some really fast 6 and 7 furlong times. What's the world record that Disco Partner set going the 6 furlongs in this race a few years ago? I think it was 105 and 2 or 105 7-3 for 6 furlongs. So, I mean, this time is kind of right in line with that. I mean, that's how fast good horses can run when these turf horses get pretty firm in the summer months. So it's just a big effort by Cogburn, an extremely fast time, but also a really impressive speed figure. I don't have too much to say about those in behind, Craig. I thought Star of Mystery got blocked for like a split second in upper stretch, was able to get through at the end. Really cool effort for a 3-year-old filly to be nearly second or just missing second in a race of this stature on the turf. But she was no match for the winner, as was nobody else at this race.
No, she's obviously really good. I mean, there's some decent sprinters in behind her, including her stablemate, who's run pretty well and, you know, won a Breeders' Cup race. So she's obviously has some real talent. Obviously, she got a pretty big weight break. I think she got 9 pounds from the winner. That will lessen as the season goes on if she keeps racing against older and colts. But regardless, she's really good.
Well, let's move on to a race that featured an extreme pace scenario, I think is the best way to put it. The Grade 1 Woody Stevens going that 7 furlong distance for the 3-year-olds. One of the fastest paces that I think I've ever seen in a top-level sprint, Craig, and maybe you can give us some context as to how fast it actually was, but no big surprise that this one really fell apart, and even the winner, Bookham Dano, I think deserves some credit for being, I mean, how far was he off the pace? He was within 10 lengths of it early, and even that might have been going a little fast, and you kind of see in his TimeformUS pace figure line, even being 8 lengths off the pace at about the midway point in the race, he ran a 1:32 pace figure, which actually dropped off a little bit to his 1:20 final time number. He getting a slight pace upgrade in his TimeformUS speed figure to a 1:23. This looked like a field that had some quality coming in. The 2 favorites did finish first and second here in Bookham Dano and Prince of Monaco. Prince of Monaco, who was really far back early, made a big run for second, but I think take nothing away from this New Jersey bred winner, Bookham Dano, Craig. He might have moved too soon, still held on to win this race, but we've got to talk about some of the speed horses who were setting that pace because those were some crazy early splits.
All right, not to delay any further, you asked, would this be the fastest pace figure in a sprint from TimeformUS? So I looked it up this morning. We're filming this on Tuesday. And there was one faster in 2015 in a nondescript race at Mahoning Valley. And I was like, this can't be right. And I went and watched the replay. And it was one that 9 years ago, who knows what happened, but I missed it. The figure was recorded, or the time was recorded as like a 21.30. I watched the replay. It was actually a 23.30. So I've actually let Equibase know about a 2015 race that had a typo. And once that gets corrected, and I'm going to be upfront, I am not going to go back and fix a figure from 9 years ago. Because it just doesn't matter at this point. But this is the fastest dirt sprint that we've ever had a pace figure for. It was just an insane pace. I mean, the 2 horses on the lead were just absolutely throwing it down. I think it was Barksdale and who was the other one?
Frost Free.
Frost Free. I mean, just pulling away by a half dozen lengths over the rest of the field. I mean, it was pretty crazy. The numbers reflect that. And you know, you're going to get these kind of results. It's not like we got a crazy result here because the favorites were off the pace. Maybe you want to make a little excuse for Prince of Monaco, who had some trouble at the start and dropped way back. But I'd probably argue that might have been fortunate and helped him even a little bit. Now, maybe he could have made up a half length with a better start. I wouldn't argue that way either, but I think they were clearly the 2 best horses. But if you have access to the TimeformUS charts, it's worth looking at the upgrades from the pace because they're pretty wild in this one.
Yeah, and I think so I was specifically asking you about that first pace figure for Barksdale, which was a 178. And you know, Craig, we talk about how you will see some extremely high early pace figures in races at the top level, but typically those are turf marathons. I know we mentioned there was a Breeders' Cup turf in past years. I think I want to say it was Shining Copper that ran off by 20 lengths in the early stages of a Breeders' Cup turf at Keeneland and got a 200 plus TimeformUS pace figure. There was a race that we talked about just a couple weeks ago at Churchill. I think it was the Kirtana, where a horse ran off off by 20 plus lengths in the early stages and got I think it was a 2:15 early pace figure for the first or second call of that race. But you don't see those kinds of numbers in dirt sprints. And the reason for that is when you're going a marathon on the turf, yeah, if you want to, you can ride a 1.5-mile turf race like it's a 5 furlong race and go out and, set a 45-second fraction to the half and basically get eased to the wire and barely make it a mile into the race before you're done. In dirt sprints, Craig, there's just less variance in how fast you can go early. I mean, at the best, horses go all out at the beginning of a dirt sprint and try to hold on, and that's pretty typical for dirt sprints. So you're comparing this number not against some horses that were just ridden poorly. You're comparing this against horses that are running as fast as they possibly can in the early stages of a race. And to say that Barksdale's 178 is the fastest ever TimeformUS pace figure for the opening quarter of a sprint, that's really saying something. So these are two extremely fast horses. I didn't think anybody could get ahead of Frost Free in the early stages, and especially coming out of the starting gate. Frost Free, I mean, he broke about a length in front of Barksdale, so Barksdale had to do even more running to get ahead of that horse early. And the way these two threw it down, I hope somebody can card a half-mile match race between these two, because that'd be something to see.
It would be, and maybe I should have looked up the adjusted fractions. We can see it there on the screen if you scroll up a little. It's actually lower than the raw time, or faster than the raw time, which is pretty rare on a track this fast. Usually the track variant would say, well, this is a really fast track. It probably needs to be quicker, but not in this case. These horses were just absolutely blazing like quarter horses out there. Obviously paid the price at the end, but any race they're in is going to be fun going forward, because those guys are seriously quick. And as for the top two and even the top three, because I don't want to knock Nutella Fella at all. Yes, he's got a great setup in here, but this was his first race since late summer last year. I think it was in Saratoga when he upset the hopeful, if I'm not mistaken. Looking at the chart there, he ran fine. The top two ran really well. So good group of 3-year-old sprinters. Look forward to seeing them. It's not like Bookham Dano and even Prince of Monaco need that kind of setup to run a big race.
No, and just kind of wrapping up this race, we spent so much time talking about also rans. Bookham Dano, he had run that really fast race in Saudi Arabia when running Forever Young to the nose decision there. I think that was maybe the best race he had run up until this point. And just nice to see the connections rewarded for running him in all of these one-turn races. They know what kind of horse he is, and he's really put forth some big efforts for them, concentrating on sprints. Prince of Monaco, big effort off the layoff. I mean, Nutella Fella ran well, Craig. He was sort of picking up pieces at the end. You see the third and fourth place finishers came from so far back in the early stages. I've got the the past performance style running lines turned on in my TimeformUS chart here. I think some of the chart calls were maybe a little exaggerated in the midpoint of this race. I don't know if recent analysis was really 27 lengths behind, but he probably was, around 20, maybe 20 plus lengths behind early in this race. So, I mean, that just speaks to how this race did fall apart in the late stages for those two to get up for third and fourth. And it's a great example of how the TimeformUS pace upgrade system works for the TimeformUS speed figures, because Barksdale got a higher fig than Nutella Fella, who finished third in this race, with Barksdale checking in 10th. That's a really extreme example of how the TimeformUS pace upgrade system works, but it's just going to show how fast that early pace really was for Barksdale to get that kind of upgrade, finishing as far back as he did. And I don't think it's wrong, Craig. We could see Barksdale do very well in some 6 furlong stakes down the line, because we know he's a fast horse. He's just probably going to need to Frost Free to not be in the race to show his true potential.
Yeah, just one quick thing before we move on. Some people might point to this race and say, well, maybe this skewed the track bias rating because, we had closers running 1-2. I can tell you, when the pace is this fast, the amount that this race is considered is really mooted a bit. So it didn't have a big effect on that not having a color coding. This race, it wasn't ignored, but it wasn't factored very heavily.
And Craig, I didn't quite comment on it, but you're really earning your title as, I don't know what it is officially, the racing's timekeeper, the Time Lord, but going back to correct that Mahoning Valley race from 9 years ago, props for that. Let's talk about a completely opposite pace situation that was in the race right before the Woody Stevens on Saturday, that the grade 1 Ogden Phipps, as you can see right away in the TimeformUS chart, all blue color coded fractions and pace figures for the early stages of this race. And actually this one needing a slight pace upgrade to sort of correct for how slow they went early in the race, Craig. It definitely did benefit the eventual winner, Randomized, who just broke very sharply, was able to get the jump on her main rival, Idiomatic, right from the start of this race. And these two really threw it down in the stretch. You could argue maybe Idiomatic had this slightly tougher trip, having to make that run from slightly off the pace, going wider around the turns, but you can't take away how game Randomized is, battling back towards the inside. We saw that attribute in the Breeders' Cup Distaff when she held on for second, and same exactly here, just a different order.
Yeah, Randomized is good. Not sure exactly what happened in her return race. Maybe that just wasn't the goal, and this was the goal as a grade 1 for her. It was her second grade 1 after taking the Alabama last year. No argument for me. She had the best trip, but I don't want to take too much away from her because the runner-up, Idiomatic, had every chance to get by this horse late and just couldn't quite do it. She was game all the way to the wire. I don't really like, you see horses going wide around the first turn here. When they're going this slow, I don't think it really matters. It was just a throwdown. The top two were the two best horses by a good amount. Nobody else really showed up. If you want to give excuses for the pace, I get it, particularly maybe for a horse like Random C, who was dead last. She was kind of totally taken out of her game. But the other three horses that ran 1, 2, 3, they had every chance, and pretty mischievous, I would say, was pretty disappointing in here.
Yeah, I think watching this race back, you could argue that maybe Florent Geroux should have been a little bit more aggressive with Idiomatic, because I think sometimes these jockeys don't have the best sense of how fast they're going, especially when the paces get a little slower than usual. And riding the best horse like Idiomatic, or the horse that looked like she was best coming into the race, you do kind of have that sense that if you're just a length and a half off the pace, you're going to be able to make up that ground. But when you let a good horse like Randomized get as comfortable as she was on the front end, going as slow as she was, you can't always take it for granted that you're going to be able to get past a horse like that. And even right here, you could see Idiomatic ranging up like she might have this one, but Randomized hadn't been asked yet by Joel Rosario, and I thought it was some great race riding by Joel, just drifting off the rail in the stretch, not to the point that he's fouling Idiomatic at all. I mean, you can watch the head onto this race, and he's keeping a straight horse as soon as he meets that rival in the middle of the racetrack, but doing just what he needed to do to make sure his filly engaged with Idiomatic on the outside. And they put on a nice show to the wire. Idiomatic just could never get her head in front of Randomized. They're two really nice horses. Obviously, the winner benefited by the race flow, as you said. A horse like Raging Sea maybe compromised a little bit, but I kind of agree with you, Craig. It did feel like nobody else in this race, even with a different pace situation, was going to be able to quite get to these top two, given the margin that they built up on the rest of the field. I don't have a whole lot to say about the others in here. Tizzy in the Sky, who was last. I think we were lucky for not to have another false start of this race, because she broke through the gate right before the start, had to be reloaded. And if you watch the replay that we just showed, I mean, she almost beat the gate again. I mean, she kind of reared up and tried to bull her way through the gate just as they pressed the button. So a horse that was very eager to begin the race, but she unfortunately was not able to produce as strong a finish as the other pace players in here. She faded the last. Let's talk about another race where it seemed like pace really influenced the outcome. I'm going to skip over the grade 2 Suburban. I'll just mention that. Krupe, a nice horse, but we've seen better editions of the Suburban, and I'm still a little bitter that Next skipped that race. I think he would have been pretty tough in there the way that it played out. As for the grade 3 Poker, which took place just before that, Craig, hard to foresee Ice Shock a lot being the speed of this race, given his past performances coming in, especially the way that they had ridden him in previous races. It just seemed like even when he broke sharply, they were content to just rip him to the back of the pack and ride him as a closer. Mark Cassidy and Jose Ortiz clearly devised a different plan this day, and boy, did it pay off for them.
Yeah, and there was some assist from the other riders, because, I mean, he was absolutely crawling early, and it's a race I'm not sure what was going on. I actually didn't watch this one live, and when I came back and watched the replay, I was a little bit shocked, to say the least. I mean, I think we had Ice Chocolat next to last on the TimeformUS Pace Projector, and deservedly so. He's never really shown any speed, but good on the connections for being aggressive. And the others really didn't make him work at all, running that early 104 TimeformUS speed figure for a quarter mile. And if you give a graded stakes horse that kind of head start, they're going to be tough to run down, and nobody was able to do it. And really, not even, he was pulling away a little bit at the end from Mysterious Night.
And you could see it right out of the gate. Jose Ortiz had a plan. He knew that there was no other speed in this race, and he sent this horse hard away from the gate. Frankly, I wish Jose Ortiz would ride like that more, because it seems like too often he's willing to give away position at the starts of races. But he came out with that clear vision of where he wanted to be on Ice Chocolat. He got there. His brother Irad on Talk of the Nation, who looked like the speed on paper, content to just let him have that easy lead through a dog-leg opening quarter. And that horse was never really able to produce the kick. It looked like he briefly stuck his head in front in mid-stretch, but Ice Chocolat had enough left to turn him away. We know Ice Chocolat can finish, and when you put a closer like that on the lead and he's still able to produce that sprint finish, he's just impossible to catch. Mysterious Night, a little unlucky, having to search for him in mid-stretch there, but he got a perfect trip up until that point, just saving ground in the pocket. And the two favorites in here, Casa Creed and Carl Spackler, both a little disappointing. I'd give Casa Creed more of an excuse because he was coming off the layoff. Maybe he needed this race a little bit. I think we'll probably see him do better in the 4-star Dave down the line later this summer at Saratoga. Let's talk about the last stakes race that we'll mention from this Saturday card, the Grade 2 True North, and it was the Saratoga specialist, Baby Yoda, who got back to close to his best form with this return to Saratoga, winning this True North by 6 lengths. Certainly didn't look like the kind of race that anybody was going to win by 6 lengths, handicapping this race on the way in. And if somebody did build up that margin, I think most people would have assumed it would have been the 3-5 favorite Gun Pilot, but that horse was somewhat disappointing, finishing third in here. And Baby Yoda, Craig, able to regain his early speed that it seemed like he had lost going back a few months or so. He kind of hinted that maybe he was returning to form last time at Aqueduct and capitalized on what was maybe not the strongest sprint field here to win by open lengths.
Yeah, this one I'm kind of proud of as the TimeformUS speed figure maker, because Baby Yoda came in with a full 5-point advantage in the last race over everybody in here, including the favorite. He had won that race at the Big A with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, and he kind of backed it up here, getting a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. Just absolutely romping. And nobody else really showed up. I mean, it was a weak addition coming in, so I'm not ready to proclaim Baby Yoda as one of the top horses of the division or anything like that, but it's good to see him show his good form, because this is a horse who, when he's good, he can run some really fast races, and this might be the first time he's put 2 of these back-to-back.
Yeah, it's been like a series of trying to fulfill potential that never really happens with Baby Yoda ever since he earned that crazy speed figure back in the summer of 2021. I think that was 3 years ago now when we saw that breakout performance from Baby Yoda at Saratoga. I think a 114 buyer. I forget exactly what the TimeformUS speed figure was. I think it was in the high 120s. Didn't quite get back to that number here, Craig, but it was still a dominant performance and victory. Another race that I think got people talking about a potential speed bias on Saturday, but there just wasn't a whole lot of running going on in behind him this day. You know, Gun Pilot, who was the big favorite in this race, I know that the speed figure he had gotten for his victory in the Churchill Downs, that was one where you had a different take than Beyer. Beyer had him, Gun Pilot, by far the fastest horse coming into this race. The numbers look very different on the TimeformUS scale. We've seen some mixed runbacks from that Churchill Downs Stakes. Gun Pilot, Craig, a horse that had run faster early in the season, but looked like he just didn't fire his best shot this day. And the rest of this field, it just wasn't really what you would typically expect from a grade 1 or grade 2 sprint race. And, you know, you made a very good point earlier about Hoist the Gold kind of running in races that maybe are too tough for him. I think Hoist the Gold would have fit pretty well in a race like this. So maybe cutting back to sprint races is going to be the right thing to do for a horse like that, because a lot of these races in the sprint division are just not coming up that tough.
Yeah, and to be fair, Hoist the Gold had his chance in that Churchill Downs race, but he had a pretty ugly
True.
trip that day, and I'd be willing to give him another chance off of that one.
Yeah, and that was also his first start back since that trip overseas to Saudi Arabia, I believe it was. Let's talk about one more race from that Saturday card before we move on to Friday. That was the first race of the day, an allowance, I believe a first level allowance, won by General Partner, the 3-year-old coming back off a layoff, having not seen him since last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And this was certainly an eye-opening return for this horse, Craig, because he had run some fast numbers as a 2-year-old. I think there were some questions at that time about how far he wanted to go. Interesting decision by Chad Brown to begin his 3-year-old campaign going a mile. He had actually been entered on Friday in a 7 furlong, or I think a 6.5 furlong allowance race, scratched out of that spot to run here instead. And I think it turned out to be the right move because he got a much more favorable pace scenario in this race, but still produced a strong finish. And as far as final times go, didn't run that much slower than National Treasure in the Met Mile.
No, you can see his overall speed figure, where his final time speed figure, I think it's a 124. Got knocked down a little bit because of the slow pace to a 121, but he was right there on that pace against a decent older horse in Black Rain. Chad Brown wasn't afraid to take on some older horses at this level, and he's a horse who he led the Breeders' Cup Juvenile for a while. He had good 2-year-old form. Obviously, something went amiss, but whatever it was seems to have been fixed because he came back with his best race yet. And that's what you want to see from a 3-year-old.
Yeah, and you might say in retrospect, should this horse have come right back in the Woody Stevens? Well, I think given the way that pace played out, Chad Brown can't be too upset that he didn't take a shot in that race because this is a horse that does like to be forwardly placed. And I think he went a little over almost 4 seconds slower to the half mile than they went in the Woody Stevens early. So it's a very different kind of pace scenario, but still, this was an impressive return for this son of Speightstown. I think the question with him now, Craig, is does this mile race give you confidence to stretch him back out to 2 turns and try a race like the Haskell? Or is he just that 1-turn horse and you want to focus on a race like the H. Allen Jerkins a little later in the summer? I tend to say shorter is going to be better for him down the line, but I could see how they might want to try longer again based on the way he finished up this day.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to say at this point because you've mentioned this in the past. As you turn back, you need a lot more early speed, and maybe this is a horse will do just better with a more comfortable pace up front and appreciate longer distances. But I could see either way. There's more money in the longer races, so maybe they give him one more shot at a big win. But this horse is pretty versatile, and I think he has some real talent, and we'll be hearing from him this summer.
Well, let's dial it back to Friday's card next because there's still plenty of stakes action to talk about from this Belmont Stakes Racing Festival that did not take place on Saturday. The feature race on Friday obviously was that Grade 1 Acorn. This used to be contested on the Belmont Stakes undercard. They shifted it to Friday to sort of take center stage on that day right before the Belmont Stakes. And I think that was the right thing to do, Craig. It's nice to see these 3-year-old fillies sort of get their time in the spotlight like they do on Derby Week for the Kentucky Oaks. And we saw the Kentucky Oaks champion come right back and validate that form over a fast track in that Acorn. I think there might have been some question coming out of the Oaks about whether or not Torpedo Anna's victory was a little bit enhanced by her appearing to really handle that sloppy track on a day when maybe others didn't. But she came back and ran an even faster speed figure on a fast track here. So she clearly is just a step ahead of everybody else right now.
She is. I mean, she's been pretty dominant. She has the one small blip on her record, and otherwise she's just trouncing every field she steps in. The Acorn was no different. I'm sure her and the connections appreciated this lengthened Acorn over what we usually see. But at the end of the day, I don't think it would have mattered. They could have ran this at 1 1/16 or even its old distance of 1 mile from the past. And I don't know that it would have mattered. She's faster than these horses early, and she's faster than these horses late. So we saw some rebounds from the Florida Derby, finished 2nd and 3rd, but they were no match, or Florida Oaks, I should have said, but they were no match for the winner. She's just clearly the best in this division. Already seeing some chatter about maybe they should try this filly against Colts. I don't know about that. The Colts have been running just as faster than she has. And there's plenty of races in this 3-year-old division that are lucrative and also prestigious. So I hope they actually resist that temptation right now. I think there's plenty of good spots for her to run in without trying to take on the boys.
Yeah, and it sounded in some of the post-race quotes like Ken McPeak was pumping the brakes on some of that talk, whereas he was a little more inclined to consider that coming into this weekend. It seemed like after she won this race, he's kind of realizing that, well, if we got these two victories, and then we can win the Coaching Club American Oaks and the Alabama, which at this point in time seems like they're there for the taking for her based on how she's trouncing the kind of horses that she'll be facing in those races. Well, then you got 4 grade ones. And if you can step up and beat the Breeders' Cup Distaff horses, well, maybe we're talking about a Horse of the Year campaign at that point. So I think he's starting to look ahead to some of those targets that are attainable for Torpedo Anna. And why not, Craig? I mean, you could just see her in the stretch of this race. I mean, for a brief moment in upper stretch, it seemed like, okay, Brian Hernandez is going to have to ask her this day and she's going to have to find more. And she found more. I mean, she was able to turn away some of those closers. Leslie's Rose was traveling into the race well, but when push came to shove in the final 8th, she was just no match for this horse. It was nice to see her, Leslie's Rose and Power Squeeze rebound. They were both horses that just seemed like they either didn't handle the trips or the track, probably in the case of Leslie's Rose in the Kentucky Oaks. Much better efforts here, but still no match for the winner. I think the big disappointment was just FYI, the runner-up in the Kentucky Oaks. She actually got ahead of Torpedo Anna early, was aggressively ridden to the lead here, but just could not sustain that pace, and she dropped away early and was basically eased to the wire. This was only her 3rd start of the campaign, but Belmont before this race was kind of already building in an excuse saying that he wasn't really pleased with her weight coming into this Acorn. And I kind of wonder if we're going to see her get a break now.
Yeah, they asked a lot of her coming off that Breeders' Cup win in a short amount of time, and maybe it just was too much for this day. I think she's a good filly, and I'm sure she'll be back, but she had nothing for the stretch. And Torpedo Anna, I really like this filly. She's one who takes it to him early. Brian Hernandez isn't afraid to use her speed. And these other fillies just can't keep up right now, and they're paying the price in the stretch. I mean, I think she has 5 wins now, and the combined margin's over 30 lengths in those wins. So, I mean, she's on the verge of being something really special if she can keep this up through the summer.
No, I mean, she's kind of reminding me of Songbird during that campaign that she had probably about a decade ago now, where, I think some people wanted her to be a little better than she was, but I mean, she was running very similar speed figures to what Torpedo Anna's are running, and while maybe not looking like the next Rachel Alexandra or Zenyatta, she was just so much better than her competition. And I think we're seeing something similar transpire with Torpedo Anna at this stage of her career. Well, there were a couple of other Grade 1 races run on this Friday card, both on the turf. The race right before the Acorn was the New York Stakes. This one just came up so tough on the way into this race. A field of 13. I think they all went to post. There were no scratches in this race. And it was a really interesting race to handicap. It played out as an interesting race to watch on the racetrack. Didia, though, Craig, kind of went off at a bit of an overlay here at 9-1. She's just been so reliable. She always seems to show up. We know that she handles the mile and 3/16 distance, and the bettors just kind of let her go. I guess there were some more appealing options in here, some newer faces that they found to be more appealing. But Didia, at the end of the day, looking back, paying $20 in this race, a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, just ignore Didier at your own risk, because she does always show up. I mean, even her Breeders' Cup filly and Mare Turf, where she was well back in the field, she finished 10th. She was only beaten 4.5 lengths that day from a tough post. Last time, I think you could just put a line through that race, one that was run with just that dawdling pace and nobody could catch the winner. But she's a filly who just is always there, and she finishes off her races. She did so once again. She got another 124 TimeformUS speed figure. She's run a bunch in those mid 120 range already, and she is one of the best horses in the division. And for whatever reason, I guess it's because she's not in one of the huge barns. She just seems to get overlooked at the windows time and time again. And she's just very talented. One of my favorite horses.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy to me to look at the wagering for this race where she was 9-1 and English Rose, who went off as the favorite in this race, to me, a crazy favorite at under 2-1. The price disparity between those two when they had finished right together in the Jenny Wiley in their prior start, and Didia had arguably run just as well as English Rose in that Jenny Wiley, considering the ground loss and the way that horses that were forward and riding the rail just seemed to have the advantage in that race. And I think we saw that Jenny Wiley result just not really mean a whole lot as you came into the Grade 1 action from this past weekend, or at least that we saw on Friday. A lot of the results from that race just didn't really hold up here, including Didia turning the tables on English Rose, who I think finished 12th in this race. She just didn't run well at all. But Didia always traveled like a winner. You could see her, the number 3 horse, sitting in 4th along the rail on this replay, just always traveling well. Jose Ortiz just had to find a seam at the top of the stretch. He does so, and it's on to victory from there. The runner-up, Nisi Marie, a good ride from Joel Rosario, who made a big backstretch move. I think the second time that we saw him do that this week in a major turf stakes race. Had to pause a little bit after making that move behind Didia, but was able to find another gear in the stretch to get up for second. And Greg, I also want to give credit to Warlike Goddess, who finished 3rd in this race. She was never in good position, got a little rank early, actually got shuffled all the way back to 13th and last at the quarter pole, and still made that run up the rail to get up for 3rd in this race, going a distance that's probably too short for her. That was a good return from the layoff for her, and I think Warlike Goddess, we're going to see better results from her in the future going longer distances.
I'm glad you brought her up. She was a horse I kind of wrote off after last year, thinking we'd seen the best of her. I know she had a couple of wins last year, but she just didn't look like the same horse to me. But I thought this was a really good return, as you said, at a distance much shorter than her best. She's pretty much a 1.5 mile specialist. So I look forward to seeing where she shows up again. I imagine she's going to stretch back out. And I think it was a promising sign for the now 7-year-old that she was able to run this well.
Yeah, and I also want to give a quick shout out to the 4th place finisher. Surprisingly, this was a race that features some red color coded pace figures. I wouldn't say it was a race that completely fell apart because Didia wasn't that far off the pace early, but surprisingly from post 13 had to be used early to press the early leader, who was actually the horse that faded to finish 10th in this race, Royalty Interest, and was right there in mid-stretch, faded a little bit right at the end of this race as the closers came upon her and swarmed in the late stages, but not a bad effort in this large field to run as well as she did from post 13. Race 10, run right before the New York, was another Grade 1 on the turf for the fillies and mares, the Just a Game, going its traditional 1 mile distance, though this time around the 2 turns as opposed to its typical 1-turn configuration at Belmont Park. Chad Brown had 5 of the 7 runners coming into this race. I think that was the big story, Craig, but I think we saw in the result of this race, Connections shouldn't necessarily be afraid of taking on that Chad Brown quintet, because Chad Brown sent out 5. 3 of them were the last 3 across the wire. The 2 non-Chads were 3rd and 4th in this race. So it's not impossible to overcome the runners that he starts in these races. He just has an abundance of them in his stable. As for Chili Flag, the winner of this race, I think it speaks to how good Chad can be with these kinds of horses, Craig, because I got to say, when she first came into his barn last year, she looked like a mediocre allowance horse. I mean, she was closing pretty well into some slow paces last summer at Belmont and Saratoga, but not looking like anything particularly special. But with each race, she's just gotten better and better, and she reliably puts in that late run regardless of pace situation. Irad Ortiz rode her with a lot of confidence here, not afraid to rate and last behind a pace that didn't really even develop that much.
No, she's a horse who can really finish off her races. And you can look at her last 2 running lines and see all the red fractions and think she got a great setup, and she did. But there was no such setup here, and she was still able to finish it off. You can see there's no color coding. The figure line actually, it increased slightly throughout the race, so it was kind of a little bit against her style, but she's one who just is relentless and is able to finish. I did want to mention, if you looked at that chart we had up, it does have the C notation, and that's because there was some rain that fell during this card. And while it certainly didn't change the turf away from that firm designation, in my opinion, it definitely changed the speed of the track enough that you couldn't rate the earlier races together with this one.
I think that's a good point. I'll show that again as we go back to the chart in just a second. We're seeing the finish of the race right here. And as I said, Irad Ortiz just rode this horse with so much confidence, content to rate Chili Flag at the back of the pack. And he knew what he had underneath him. She produced that strong run through the stretch. I thought White Beam ran on well for second, but she was right on top of the pace. And while the pace didn't necessarily hold together the way that you might have expected it to based on how the pace figure line looks, I still think it was a step in the right direction for White Beam, who has lost 4 in a row now since last year's Diana, but I think this could set her back up well for a title defense in the Diana, where I assume we'll see plenty of these Chad Brown horses rematch against each other. Good effort by Mission of Joy, who drew the rail, but actually wound up off the rail for much of this trip and went wide around that second turn. She stayed on well for third, beaten less than a length in this race. So, like I said, not impossible to compete with these Chad Brown runners. We saw that from a Mission of Joy, who went off at a big price, 13-1 on her, 26-1 on Heavy Jets. Neither one of them lost this race by much more than a length. So a competitive result, as you might expect. That C notation that Craig's talking about, it's shown right next to all the speed figures. That will show up in the past performances when these horses come back. If you're curious about any of those letter codes next to the speed figures, when you're in the TimeformUS past performances, just click on them and an explanation will come up. If you're not familiar, don't memorize what all of those different letter codes mean. Even I don't have a handle on all of them, and I'm immersed in these PPs. Well, Craig, let's discuss the one other stakes from this Friday card. It was the Grade 2 Intercontinental run right before that trio of Grade 1 races. This one, a slight upset, as Future is now just barely able to hold off the 2-5 favorite Roses for Deborah. And kind of like the Just a Game that you just talked about, Craig, there was a weather delay right before this race. Some rain fell. I don't know if it changed the speed of the turf course that much, but it might have affected Roses for Deborah a little bit, because we know that Roses for Deborah is a horse that wants that firm ground, hasn't run as well over courses that have taken rain right before the race is run. So maybe that was the difference for her. But I will say, Future is now, she might just be an improving 4-year-old. We had seen her show potential last year. She just won that race on Preakness Day and came right back here with another big victory.
Yeah, and honestly, this is one I probably should have gave a C to as well. I should probably go back and do that, because it was a race where there was a turf sprint run earlier and there was a noticeable change in speed. I think the track variant was 18 points less. Now, it was still a firm turf course, because, I mean, it was obviously very firm before the rain, and it wasn't like a torrential, long-lasting downpour. So it definitely changed the track, and maybe that was to the detriment of Roses for Deborah, but I don't want to take too much away from the winner. I thought she ran fine in here. She has good tactical speed. She was able to get the jump, and oftentimes that's the difference in these turf sprints. She's also just a 4-year-old. So she should be improving, and she has been improving. Her speed figures just keep getting gradually better. The one time they didn't was at Laurel, where she was hooked early in really fast fractions and kind of gave it up. But she's pretty good. So I wouldn't argue if you told me Roses for Deborah is the better female turf sprinter right now, but Future is getting better and better as well.
Well, there are some non-stakes events that we should also mention on this Friday card, a trio of dirt races that all earned some nice speed figures. The 8th race was that aforementioned first-level allowance race. The general partner actually scratched out of to run on Saturday instead, and there were some key scratches in this race that took a lot of the early speed out. It's not like El Capi, though, needed much speed in the race to set some fast fractions all by himself. He is just a naturally fast horse. We saw that on debut, where he might have been a little carried along by that speed and rail bias on Cigar Mile Day. He just looked like he needed a race coming back off the layoff here, but he set up some quick splits in the early stages for Jefferson Street. And the reason that there's no red color-coded pace figures in this race is just due to how fast the winner finished off this race. Jefferson Street, opening up 8 lengths on this field through the stretch. He really ran well. Not sure that he was beating much in behind him at the end of the day, Craig, with El Capi not showing up, but I don't think it matters when you win by this kind of margin.
No, he was really impressive through the stretch, drawing off the win by 8 lengths. Really impressive performance. He got a career best 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure. He is just a 3-year-old still. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about this race. And he's one, I'm curious what you think, but I'd like to see this guy get a chance to go longer and try 2 turns, because the way he finished this one off and given his breeding, it seems like it would be within his scope.
Yeah, I mean, I think they must have been considering that earlier in his career. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think he competed in that 1 mile maiden race out of the Wilson chute when Locked won so impressively. I want to say he was third in that race. That might have even been his career debut. I hope I'm not confusing him with a different horse.
No, he was not in that race.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm confusing him with a different horse. That's a different.
He was in
Belmont
General
runner.
Partner.
Okay,
Yeah, he was in with General Partner.
Confusing those strong Saratoga maiden races from last summer. But regardless of any of that, I don't disagree, Craig. I think he's a horse that maybe could go a little farther. He does strike me as one that kind of has that natural quickness where maybe he's a little better suited to sprinting. But given the performance of him and General Partner from Saturday and the horses in the Woody Stevens, if they all end up in a race like the H. Allen Jerkins later this summer, that's going to be a really strong Grade 1 affair for these 3-year-old sprinters. So I think we've got a strong class of them. It's going to be fun to see if they all are able to get to that race and how they get there, because there's probably going to be a start between now and then for maybe a few of these, particularly Jefferson Street and General Partner, who just won allowance races. But definitely some exciting 3-year-olds out there who maybe did not run in the Triple Crown races. Another dirt race to mention from this Friday card was another first level allowance race. This one for the fillies and mares, won by the 4-year-old Money's Gold. And she was strangely eligible for this N1X allowance, even though she's a 3-time winner, that being because she is a Florida bred who twice competed against Florida bred company. So those races being restricted affairs, I guess, don't count towards the allowance condition for this race. So she wound up in here and just proved better than these horses, Craig. I guess she ran to the 3 to 5 odds. The speed figure says she did. Only won this race by 2 lengths. I'm still a little skeptical of her. I don't fully trust her, but maybe this wasn't the right time to take a shot against. And I'll be interested to see how she does when she gets back into stakes company and has to come off Lasix again.
Yeah, you're saying exactly what I was thinking as well. She's a bit of a bully. She looks great when she beats up on inferior competition. A couple of those wins came against Florida breds, as you note. Didn't really have a straw on her path. She's 0 for 3 in stakes races. Now, don't get me wrong, they were very good stakes races with very good fillies, but she's won until I see it against the better horses where she's challenged on the front end, because that's really been the difference. Is when she gets tested early, she usually gets into some trouble, and she didn't get tested much here. I mean, she's quick when she gets things her own way. She's good, but I'm going to need to see it again. And until I see it against better horses, she's one that I think her reputation's always going to see her getting over bet.
Another dirt allowance race on Friday that really turned some heads early in the day was the second race triumph by Arthur's Ride, going the same distance as the Belmont Stakes this year, the 1.25 miles, and actually ran a faster raw time than the Belmont Stakes in victory here, with a slightly different pace scenario, Craig. But this horse, I think if you just throw out his race over the sloppy track at Churchill Downs on Derby Day, where it seemed like he really just did not care for that surface at all of his other races are good. And this seems like the kind of horse that is probably going to try stakes company next time and might do pretty well against some of those older stakes horses that we've been seeing based on a few of the speed figures that he's earned both here and 3 back when he was second off the layoff for Belmont, or I think actually maybe coming off the layoff for Belmont to begin his 4-year-old campaign. He's had some long breaks during his career, but when he's good, this horse is really good.
He can be really good, and this was the best we've seen from him, running a 1:23 TimeformUS speed figure. Never really had a straw in his path. If he ran his race, he pretty much had this field over a barrel speed figure wise, but you had to question that last one at Churchill. But as you said, he's been good in almost all his fast track starts. Well, he has been decent in all of them. And this was a pretty big one. Nice speed figure. I did want to ask you, this is a day, since we're talking about the last dirt race, we're going to talk about that. It does have the red color coding. This was a day I may not disagree so much. I need to go back and watch these races, but I do think this was even a little more speed favoring than a normal Saratoga track.
I don't disagree in the sense that, well, just look at the replay we're watching at here of Arthur's Ride. I mean, there are some big gaps between these horses coming to the stretch. I know Arthur's Ride won by almost 13 lengths, basically getting geared down to the final furlong, but there were some pretty good, reliable horses like Leading Contender, who was fourth or fifth in this race, who just lost by huge margins. I mean, 20, 30 lengths. Was that due to this track favoring speed or favoring the rail? I don't know. I will say this was a day, Craig, when there was rain in the forecast and maybe the track maintenance crew had to make some decisions about when to water the track. And maybe this is a Saratoga track that when they're not consistently watering it and it gets dry, it creates that really tiring situation that favors horses that are towards the front end, that don't have to deal with that kickback. So I wouldn't say that it was consistently impossible to close throughout the day, but you did see some races like this where a horse like Leading Contender, who was very consistent up until this point, running speed figures of 110 plus, takes this huge drop off and loses by 30 lengths. Maybe this is the kind of race where you want to be a little forgiving of some of the horses that lost by these huge margins. Not to take anything away from Arthur's Ride. He's obviously really good, but he got very comfortable on the front end. There was a loose horse who got ahead of him for a brief moment, but didn't seem like he really bothered him. And you got to give credit to a horse that's able to come home his final quarter of a mile and a quarter race in, 24.19 seconds. I mean, he was really finishing strongly, some of that due to the pace, but also due to the inherent stamina that this horse possesses. But how exaggerated this result was, I think it's fair to attribute some of that to the racetrack.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, this was a race that was rated the same track variant wise. They were the two-turn races along with Torpedo Anna. There was no reason to change the track variant. The speed looked pretty consistent throughout the day. So it was a fast race. It's just a matter of if you think maybe the track was helping him a little. But Torpedo Anna, we know she didn't really need that. So I tend to lean on the side. This was a really good race by Arthur's Ride.
Yeah, Craig, we've gone already longer than I think we intended to, but let's quickly mention some races from that Thursday card at Saratoga, since I think there were a few worth discussing. That Belmont Gold Cup, what an exciting race that was to finish off that first day of the festival. I mean, you don't expect 2-mile affairs to produce thrilling finishes all the time, but this one certainly delivered in that department with 3 horses hitting the wire together. And even beyond that, I mean, interesting pace dynamics, unreasonable early fractions that took their toll on the leaders, a favorite that was way too close to it didn't show up, and multiple moves. I mean, this race really had it all.
Yeah, and they were all gray in the top 3, if I remember right. It was a pretty cool race. It's one we do make figures for. I don't make pace figures. I know you had kind of hoped I would. Given how the pace played out, I probably would have had this race been run at Belmont, where we had some back data to actually make them. But there's really nothing at Saratoga to go by. They only did fractions for a couple of them, I think, because they're not really set up to time this kind of race. So I think there was only a couple early fractions, but I'm with you. I would imagine they would have been really hot, like way up there in the 170s or so, maybe even faster than that. Particularly given a 2-mile race. The horses up front just went way too fast, and the Gray Wizard was able to take advantage. I rated the race a 120. That's just kind of more based on how the horses all finished in relation to each other, not really the time of the race, but a fun race for sure. And I hope it's one we keep seeing. I imagine we will. I mean, it's a grade 2 at this point, and every year it seems to be a fun race.
Yes, some really interesting rides put in here. I mean, for instance, Joel Rosario on Champagne Juan, a horse that I liked in this race. I never imagined it'd be 9-2, but I mean, he seemed like a horse that was one of the rare American-bred horses that actually looked like he would want the 2-mile distance, and I think that was right. But boy, did Joel make him use his stamina in this race, because he started moving with about 5 furlongs to go, went from a dozen lengths back to leading the race by the time they left the backstretch in the span of about a furlong and a half. And asked this horse to hold on to the lead for the last half mile of this race, and he almost did it. But I mean, that's a tough ask for a horse like that, and almost got the job done. I know he was vanned off after this race. Hopefully, all was okay with him, because this was an exciting effort. The Gray Wizard, though, Craig, I mean, he's a bit of a plotter, but we know he's got stamina, and the last move certainly turned out to be the best move in this Belmont Gold Cup.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you mentioned. I think he was the runner-up in this race last year. He does well in these extended races. I hope they're able to find some more for him, because, yeah, he's a fun horse to root for. And I know I'm getting older, but I still like horses with cool names. And you have to like the Gray Wizard if you like names.
Well, Chad Brown was able to use a 1 mile race out of the Wilson Chute to get general partner of stakes horse from last year back on track. And it was a similar thing on the Thursday with Ways and Means, who wasn't coming off the same kind of layoff as general partner, but had lost a few stakes events in a row after being so impressive at Saratoga last summer. And they just got back to a softer spot with her to give her a needed confidence boost, Craig. And I think they got exactly what they wanted out of this allowance victory. She was just better than these horses. I mean, you could see that in the price. She went off at 1-5 and delivered, but also got a pretty impressive speed figure, suggesting that she's going to be ready to step right back up into stakes company.
Yeah, she's a horse who, I mean, I would say she got rushed a little bit to the Oaks, but she acquitted herself quite well, running a decent fourth while no match for Torpedo Anna, but who really is right now. So I don't want to knock her. And I was really impressed by this race. To get a 118 speed figure is impressive enough for a 3-year-old filly, but to do it from off the pace against overmatched horses who weren't going particularly fast early, it was just a solid pace. I thought this was really impressive, and she finished off the race strong. And I would imagine that's probably the last time we'll ever see Ways and Means in an allowance race, because she's got some real talent. And outside of Torpedo Anna, there's no reason she can't beat the rest of the horses in this division. She's proven to be just as fast.
Yeah, no, I did not expect her to get much of a test in this race. I mean, she just looked so much better than the competition on paper, so you didn't expect to take a whole lot away from this race. But like you, I did appreciate the way that she rated and finished as powerfully as she did. So I think this is going to set her up pretty well for a likely target of the Grade 1 test. I think Chad Brown's mentioned that's what they're thinking with her, as opposed to going back to 2 turns. She's not an Alabama horse. She doesn't want 1.25 miles. So I think they're believing that 7 furlongs could be the right distance for her. And based on the way she ran as a 2-year-old, that should be really a perfect trip for her. But she's going to have to face some good 3-year-old fillies that are pointing to that race. And I think we could segue right into a horse that she's likely to line up in the starting gate against in the test. And that's the winner of the Jersey Girl on this Thursday card, Almost Gone Rocket for Brad Cox. Another horse who delivered at a very short price, going off at 2-5, and probably not getting tested against nearly as tough competition as she'll faced in that test stakes a little bit later in the summer. But you had to like the way she did it on Thursday, Craig.
Yeah, she's now won 3 races by a combined 22 lengths, all sprinting, where it's harder to extend those margins. So she obviously has some real talent. She ran a 1:17 TimeformUS speed figure. She's going to be, I would assume she's going to be a test runner. Probably see her maybe even before that. But I do have a little bit of question. She hasn't really been in a race that featured a lot of pace yet. But she has good tactical speed. She's going to be dangerous. But I want to see her get tested to see just how good this filly is, because I don't think we've really seen that just yet.
I agree. I want to see her get tested against some serious competition. I don't know if there turned out to be a whole lot behind her in this race. The runner-up, Monima Gold, she was undefeated coming in here, but all of those races over in Dubai, so hard to gauge her quality, and just wasn't a whole lot of running or showing up behind her in this race. So she's going to get a real test, I think, when she steps up against some tougher horses. She might be that good, but I think it still remains to be seen. And, Ways and Means actually ran a point faster than her on the TimeformUS speed figure scale. And we already know that Ways and Means can hang with some tougher fillies. One more race to talk about from this Thursday card, Craig. There were a couple of 2-year-old stakes races. The Astoria did not go particularly fast. Just want to give a quick mention to the Tremont for the Colts. Early in the day, this was the first stakes of this Belmont Stakes Racing Festival, and produced a nice finish from the winner, Studley Do Right, who came from off the pace. Nice to see a 2-year-old rate and finish the way that he did. Ran down a well-meant Wesley Ward, first-time starter in Touchy. Actually, both of these are sons of Nyquist, but Studley Do Right, I think his experience really helped him get over the line first in this event.
Yeah, I was kind of glad to see this as a Maryland native. Good to see the Maryland shipper come in and get the job done for John Robb, who's seemingly been training horses for forever in Maryland, if my memory serves. But yeah, good for him. I always like to see these smaller barns able to ship in. It was a solid speed figure for a 2-year-old in 96. Thought both him and the Wesley Ward horse ran fine, but the way he was able to do it coming from off the pace, that always impresses me a little bit more with these 2-year-olds, because so often these races are won by horses on the front end. And I just like to see the little versatility, which will come in handy as distances get longer.
Yeah, he had done that on debut, came from off the pace, rallied to victory, albeit against a weaker field, but was able to pull off the same feat here against some tougher foes. We had already seen a few horses in this race run well in their previous starts. The 3rd and 4th place finishers. Touchy was talked about. He was the best 2-year-old that Wesley Ward has in a stable. That runner-up did get to wandering in the stretch, drifting out and then back in. I think there was maybe some unnecessary race riding from Joel Rosario in the late stages, but when you're riding an inexperienced 2-year-old, sometimes they overreact to a few of those cues, and I think that might have been going on with Touchy. But Studley Do Right, unbothered by it, and was able to get up to win this race. We'll see if he's able to hold this form when the competition gets a little bit tougher and the distances stretch out later in the summer. Well, Craig, that wraps up our recap of the Belmont Stakes Racing Festival. Obviously, so much great racing to talk about from this last week. I feel like I'm still catching my breath from the last weekend, but we will be back later this week to do our typical TimeformUS forecast. Still have to look at how some of the weekend racing is coming up to see which circuit we want to focus on. Obviously, Belmont at the Big A will be returning. Action from Aqueduct, Churchill Downs. I think Monmouth has a nice card on Saturday. So we'll see how some things come up and try to find the best pick 5 sequence for you guys to follow along with us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I did just want to mention one thing. I hope you won't mind, but a good friend of mine, a guy who's been a guest on this show, Chuck Simon, is sick right now with cancer. There's a GoFundMe out there on X that is getting quite a response. It brought a tear to my eye when I saw how horse players out there are responding. So I just want to mention that if you can, please check it out and donate. If you can't, just keep Chuck in your thoughts. He's a great guy, a real friend of horse racing. Don't know anybody that loves it more than he does. So think good thoughts for him, and hopefully I'll be able to have him as a guest on this show in the future.
No, I donated last night. I'm happy you mentioned that, Craig. Obviously, all of our best thoughts are going to Chuck at this time. We always appreciate his perspective. He's somebody who is willing to speak the truth of his opinion about the sport and always has the best interest of racing in mind. So we definitely wish the best for him in this fight that he's currently embarking on. So glad that you were able to bring that up. And I know, Craig, you tweeted out that link last night in case anybody wants to find it. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up a little bit later in the week.